Look, I think Australia does have a very real challenge to face because we have an unusual, in some ways you might say a unique history. Ever since European settlement of this continent in 1788, it's always been the case that either Britain for a while, and then when Britain's power fell, America has been the dominant power in our part of the world and a close ally and supporter and defender of Australia. So we've never really had to address the question of how we would make our way in an Asia which wasn't really dominated and framed for us by the power of an English speaking ally, a very powerful English speaking ally like Britain or America. I think now, for the first time in our history since European settlement, Australia faces the prospect of trying to make its way in an Asia which is no longer dominated in that way by our great allies. We're going to have to work in that kind of multipolar Asia in which the strongest powers are going to be countries like China and India, and in which countries like Indonesia, which is, of course, our next door neighbour, will also be very, very strong powers. This is a very different kind of challenge for Australia. Now, I think the crises, particularly the crisis in Ukraine in recent years, has sharpened Australia's understanding of the new world we live in. Because I think, Russia's challenge to the European order and to America's place in Europe and the failure of the West to respond effectively to that challenge has, I think, made clearer to Australians that the assumption we've made for so long that somehow America would always find a way to prevail, I think that assumption has proved to be invalid. And I think it has been clearer, for example, that the kind of challenge the United States would face in a crisis over Taiwan is one that America is going to find it very hard to meet. So I think it's induced more realism about the future of America's power in Asia, and therefore a sharper sense that Australia must come to terms with this fundamental long-term shift in the distribution of power globally and what that means for the way in which Asia operates. For a long time, we've tended to believe, I think more or less correctly, that the big decisions about what happened in our part of the world would be shaped by Washington, or before that by London. We now, I think, recognise we're going to live in an Asia where the big decisions, the things that really matter to us, are going to be made in our own region, in Beijing, in Tokyo, in Jakarta, in Delhi, and Australia is going to have to learn to work in that kind of environment. Now, this is not a new issue for Australia. All the way back 30, 40 years ago, Australian political leaders like Bob Hawke and Paul Keating were saying that Australia needed to look forward to a future in which it sought its security not from Asia, but in Asia. And I think that idea is one that's really now coming to pass. That's the challenge we're really facing.